Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 1 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, this is a new tournament for me. If you followed the last video, you know that I finished up round 9 in the Reykjavik Open, and now I was actually off to Germany. So just a quick story time before I get into the game. I stopped in Denmark. I went from Reykjavik to Copenhagen to actually be there for a few days with my grandparents. If you know, I actually play under the Danish flag now, and I have Danish family in Denmark. And it was great to see my grandparents and be around them. And it was a short intermediate stop before going on to Germany. Now, the Grenke Chess Open actually runs alongside the Grenke Chess Classic, which is actually one of the premier closed tournaments in the world, actually, at the moment, because Magnus Carlsen typically plays, and it's typically a good mix of a few talented German players and then all the top international stars. And this year was no different. I think Levin Aronian, Peter Svidler, Magnus Carlsen, of course, Vishy Anand, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, a very, very strong closed event. And the way it's set up is we're actually all playing under this huge, almost like Oktoberfest style type of balloon of a tent. And under this tent, the top players in the top section were actually on stage, the Anands, Carlsens of the world, and then off of the stage was where the Open was going on. So it was actually really cool to be able to play your games and then simultaneously see the top guys in the same room as you, and it was a real treat to be a part of that. Now, the Grenke Chess Classic actually didn't start the same time as the Open. The Open started a few days previously, and so we did have the hall to ourselves for the first few days, but it was a really, really awesome treat to see the strongest players in the world playing alongside you in the same venue eventually. So anyways, let me shift gears and now talk about the Open. So, it is an open tournament, and, when you're playing in an Open, you typically play down the first few rounds, and you have to prove your mettle. And my opponent in this one was an untitled player by the name of Kien Tran. I'm sure I might be bludgeoning that name, so apologies if you actually know how to pronounce it. But he was a 2100 player from Germany. So without further ado, let me get into it. And I was white in this one, by the way. So I opened with d4, and my opponent played knight f6, and I went for knight f3, and then g6 was played. And g6 is a fairly, interesting and a move, because you actually don't really know whether it's going to be a King's Indian or a Grunfeld until they play d6 or d5. So I still had to wonder, like, okay, what is the right setup here? So after g6, I went for c4. And then black went bishop g7, and I still don't know, is it a King's Indian or a Grunfeld? And if you've seen this channel before, you know that the Grunfeld has been kind of a soft spot for me in some respects, where I kind of switched up variations. So I wasn't sure whether I should actually just go g3 here and play a fianchetto, or actually go into the Grunfeld, because now that I've actually played knight f3 right away, some of my options as far as the Grunfeld are cut. So, for instance, if we went through a traditional move order in the Grunfeld with c4, not c3, c4, and then g6, knight c3, d5, here I have a bevy of variations. So I have bishop g5 as an option, I have bishop f4 as an option, but basically the point is that I haven't committed this knight on f3, so I actually have the classical variation as well, which is the bishop c4 line. So I could play in this way, where my knight is placed on e2. And this is a line of the Grunfeld that, is heavy in theory, but it's just another way of setting up. And the point is, by playing knight f3 very early, I essentially take away that option from myself. So that was something I actually was keenly aware of, and I was thinking, before I played knight c3, I was thinking, well, maybe I don't want to play some like a mainline theoretical Grunfeld. But I thought about this for a quick second and then played my next move, knight c3. And then black bashed out d5, and I was like, oh man, what have I gotten myself into? And the reason for that is because I basically have gotten a Grunfeld line where I have a lot less options than I would have with my knight on still on g1, and I pretty much am probably going to go down a theoretical path, which my opponent would know pretty well, because, you know, what you find with a lot of these Grunfeld devotees is that they know a lot of the lines fairly well, and so you're actually often not really playing on your own until closer to move 20. And I didn't want to get that kind of game, which is a theory battle. I wanted to get a game where, you know, my actual strength could show by the quality of my moves, not the quality of my memorization. So I was already a little bit sort of annoyed at the fact that I sort of allowed a sharp theoretical line. So anyways, when I got to this position, I had to think about what course of action was I going to take? Which line of the Grunfeld would be one that might confuse him a little bit, might be a little bit imbalanced. And on this day, I decided that bishop g5 would be the lucky winner. And the point is that normally in a lot of lines, the main lines, white is often sacrificing a pawn for a lot of activity. So typically it goes knight e4, bishop f4, and then knight takes c3, b takes c3, and d takes c4. And I'd already played a game once in this line this year against Rohan Ahuja in the, I believe it was the Charlotte Spring GM-IM Invitational in March. So I was kind of keen on improving on that game because I did have some thoughts after that game ended in a draw and I didn't play very well. So I thought maybe I can try and improve on that game. But instead, after knight e4, he also bashed this out, and I was like, you know what? Maybe he's seen that game, and even, you know, he kind of has an idea what to do. So I kind of got cold feet at the last moment, and instead went for bishop f4, which is a little bit of a safer move. The point is that after knight takes c3 and b takes c3, my bishop is actually trained on the c7 pawn, and it's very difficult for black to hold on to the c4 pawn if they take on that square. So instead, they actually play d takes c4, and then after e3, they tend not to play b5 to reinforce it because I'm a little bit, I've already a lot of influence on the center, and b5 is a bit of a risky proposition. Already I can play a move like a4, and after a6, they can't do that because the pin on the a file. And if they play c6, I actually have, I believe there's even c takes b5, and bishop takes b8 for what it's worth, and I can recover the pawn. Although I'm not too sure what the consequences of this are because I did give up the two bishops. But in any case, this didn't happen. b5 wasn't played, and I felt that if he did play b5, I was going to, have my targets to work with. And so he actually went for c5, and this is also another main line in the system where you don't try to hold on to the pawn, and you just kind of try to play very actively under slightly worse circumstances. The idea is that after bishop takes c4, c takes d4, and c takes d4, white has a position where they have, a fairly reasonable structure, but on the flip side, these queenside pawns could be a factor in the end game. So something I had to concern myself with. So anyways, after c takes d4, queen a5 check was played, and this was another kind of source of annoyance for me because essentially it's just kind of forcing, and it kind of forces my hand because now I have to block on d2, and I didn't like the idea of playing knight d2 to retreat because you have a scenario where, this knight is a little bit passive on d2 and maybe e5 is a break. So instead, I decided to go queen d2. And after queen d2, you have a scenario where essentially, now we're already going for an endgame, and I kind of have to prove that my space advantage in the center and potential control of the c file gives me some type of advantage, but it's not quite sure that's the case. So this is what I went for, but it's unclear how much of an advantage I actually have, And in a lot of these Grunfeld endgames, black gets just enough counterplay on the c-file when he winds up castling that it's kind of tough to win these ones. So I wasn't super optimistic about my chances here, and also just was kind of frustrating because he's able to bang out all of his moves very quickly and hadn't really thought too much on his own yet. So anyways, knight c6 was played. I thought this was a very smart move because now you're kind of keeping the tension on these queens, and you're also kind of saying, well, if you take on a5, then after knight takes, the bishop is attacked. And one of the things that's kind of important is having this bishop stay on this diagonal. Because if you don't stay on the diagonal, then the bishop can actually go to e6 and control it. So in this position, I actually decided to keep the tension, and I went for rook c1. You could also argue for rook b1, and some lines maybe the rook is also pressuring b7, and that's something you can consider. But I thought that rook b1 would be a reasonable move, I thought rook c1 was reasonable, and I did want to contest for the c-file, so I thought that was most consistent. After castles, I now took on a5, but at least now I control the c-file, so I thought pretty good about it. And after knight takes a5, I really did not want this bishop to come to e6 with tempo attacking a2, so I wanted to fight for this diagonal, and I decided to play the very interesting bishop d5. And the point is that on d5, I kind of make sure the bishop doesn't have this diagonal, and I keep some pressure on b7. One idea I was thinking about here is the potentially playing bishop c7. So let's say like a bad move like h6 is played. I thought maybe bishop c7 was an option targeting this knight, and it really just has to come back to c6 because b6 would hang the rook on a8. So I thought this was one interesting way to play. So after bishop d5, I thought, okay, like he probably should consider challenging this bishop or trying to get his rook connected in some way. And he should have actually played bishop f5. This would have been the cleanest way, and it turns out that black is completely equalized. The point is now my bishop on d5 will ultimately be a target after rook fd8, whereas and if he plays rook d8 right away, it's tactically not very good because there are scenarios where bishop c7 is an option. And yeah, it's just a little bit shaky to put the rook here so early because I can also play bishop e4 and dart out like that and still keep pressure on b7. So yeah, so instead of rook d8 right away, you play this bishop f5 move, you get your rooks connected, and you're already well suited to pressure my bishop on d5, and you actually managed to connect your rooks before me, and you know how I feel about that. Usually the side that connects the rooks first has a fairly advantageous position. So in this position, the line would continue knight d2, so that the bishop has a square on this diagonal. Rook a d8, challenging that bishop. Note that it can't go back now because both those squares are covered by the knight. And I pretty much need to go to f3. But now, as is the case in many Grunfelds, you can play tactically, and there's actually a really nice solution here to kind of, seize the initiative. So why don't you pause the video now and try to figure out what that solution is. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to figure out what the move is here for black that would break open the position. And the move is actually e5. And it is a pawn sacrifice, but the point is, as long as my king is stuck on e1, the knight on d2 will be very insecure. Or on d2 will be very insecure. So you can imagine that after a line like d takes e5, well, now after rook fe8, first of all, this pawn is going to be recaptured quite easily, but also my king on e1 is now frozen in the center because my knight on d2 is hanging, and black would be completely fine here. And white would actually have to be a little careful not to hand over the initiative. So, yeah, black is just fine in this type of position. Now, instead of bishop f5, black played bishop d7, and this was a move that was very strange looking to me because, at first sight, it looked like I could just gallop into c7 and the d7 bishop would be hit. And, it just seems like I'm sort of getting somewhere with my play because now the e7 pawn is loose, the d7 bishop is loose. And, unprotected pieces are usually there's usually tactics where unprotected pieces lie. So I darted in for rook c7, and then I thought, okay, this position actually looks kind of good for me, because now it just seemed like I had a lot of pressure. And it was, with real surprise that after a few minutes of thought, my opponent went for rook a c8, a move that I hadn't really seriously considered. And I kind of stopped and I was wondering, what am I missing? What am I missing? Isn't the d7 bishop just hanging? And okay, after, 10 seconds of looking, I saw that after rook takes d7, rook c1 check would be problematic, because my rook on h1 would be lost. But then I started to look deeper and I thought, well, if rook takes d7, rook c1 check, I go king e2, he takes on h1, and then his rook is temporarily out of play, and I have a rook on the 7th rank, and then I can consider rook takes e7. And I thought that here I would have, a pawn for the exchange. This bishop would be pretty good. My rook would be on the 7th rank. And, I was wondering, do I have enough compensation there? What is the evaluation? And then after that, I thought, well, maybe the rook will come back out to c1. And I thought, I'm not so sure if I have enough compensation there. Is this playable? Because if I lose the rook, if I lose my lone rook after losing my h1 rook, my thought process was, well, these passed pawns might be a factor on the queen side. And the reason I showed you all those arrows before is just to give you a sense of my mental process before I even, made my decision. And unfortunately, I kind of stopped and said, you know what? I stopped the calculation and said, you know what? I think rook c1 check will be too much. I'm not sure I have enough compensation. But it turns out I was completely wrong. And rook takes d7 is actually a winning move. So let's try and break that down a little bit further. Rook takes d7, right? Rook c1, check. King e2. Rook takes h1. Rook takes e7. And then the move I was concerned about was this rook c1 move. And I was like, well, what about rook c2? What about my king getting harassed? Do I have enough compensation for the pawn here? But it turns out in this position, white is already winning. And there are actually a few decent ways to win, but one that's very clear cut. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out white to play and win? Because I have a feeling, a lot of you would be able to find this one. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out what to do. It turns out the winning move, and, this was something that I looked at. I just kind of, stopped, was knight g5. And the point is that after knight g5, you have a scenario where f7 is just being hit multiple times. And it's just a totally lost position, because if rook c2 check, I can even pop out to f3 with my king and it's totally secure. And, I'm just in great shape here. Now, I think the thing that sort of threw me off this trail was I was wary of bishop f6, because I thought now this bishop is getting rid of one of my important pieces. And I wasn't entirely sure if after rook takes f7, knight takes f7, that this would be a winning position for me. But of course, these central pawns play a huge factor, and this bishop on d5 is doing an excellent job of covering a2, and this knight is going to need a few moves to get into the game, so this is just, very favorable. But instead of actually playing, rook takes f7, I actually can keep the rook if I'm so concerned about losing my rook and go rook d7. And this is actually even cleaner, because I'm still threatening knight takes f7, so bishop takes g5 pretty much has to be played. And after bishop takes g5, this rook is frozen on f8 because of the f7 pawn, and I'm also threatening bishop h6. So the position is just completely won. And the point is now, like, king g7 would be the only way to stop bishop h6, but now I can go bishop e7, challenge the rook on f8, and if the rook moves away, I can just move the bishop and retain threats on the f7 pawn. Oh, excuse me, maybe bishop d6 is actually the best move, because here rook c7 isn't possible. So just a totally winning position that I, overlooked. And these bishops are just incredibly strong here because the king is just, going to get cut to pieces. So a huge, huge missed opportunity. And frankly, the reason I rejected it, sadly, is that I was wary of this bishop f6 move. And that just showed, incorrect thinking, because even if I am going to lose my last rook, like I just showed, I have more than enough compensation having, 2 pawns for the exchange here and really strong bishops. So it's just something I should have gone for. So anyways, instead of this line, I thought and that's the other thing, is I thought for like 20 minutes here, pretty much more, maybe like 25 minutes, working out some of these details. And, I decided to go in a different direction. But, really and truly, I should have gone in the direction that I spent most of my calculating time. Because normally that's the way it goes, where if you spend most of your time in one variation, that's probably the best chance you're going to have in the game anyway, unless it's like completely lost. Because, who's to say they saw all the things that you saw? So, that's also just a general tip, is normally trust, do what you wind up spending most of your time thinking on. So anyway, I decided rook takes d7 wasn't a possibility, and I didn't want to take on c8 because that just gave him, gave him control of the c file. So I decided to play king d2, at least trying to fight for the c file with rook c1. But the issue is now he's able to take on c7, and after bishop takes c7, he has a very, very, very strong move. Now, I thought in this position I would still be able to control the c file because the a5 knight was hanging. So I thought that if he went for b6, I would go rook c1, and I actually evaluated this position to be slightly better for me because I not only control the c file, but now this bishop on d5 dominates this knight on a5. And this is actually something that happens in a lot of Grunfeld lines, where this knight on a5 has no squares because the bishop is really doing a fantastic job of dominating it. And that's also the case because the knight no longer has support to come back on the c file. So normally b6 is a kind of double-edged move in the Grunfeld because you protect the knight, but you also take away its squares back toward the c file. So I thought I'd be better in this position. But it turns out in this position that black has a move that is infinitely stronger than b6 and gives me a world of problems. And that move that shocked me to my core was the move e6. And I was very impressed with this move. It's extremely alert by my 2100 opponent to play this, because it really just shows a very, very keen understanding of the dynamics here. And they are as follows. The bishop pair is the most important thing in many positions, and the Grunfeld is no different. And if I take this knight here, after e takes d5, even though white has 2 pawn islands and black has 3 pawn islands, this d5 pawn is hardly a target. I mean, the knight is 2 diagonals away, so we know if a knight is 2 diagonals away, that takes 3 moves just to attack it. And on the flip side, black is quick to contest on the c file and improve his position and have the 2 bishops as a latent force. The other thing is that these outside pass pawns, 2-on-1 on the outside, is something that the black player, the Grunfeld player, does not mind having, because if outside pass pawns can be a real problem to defend. So this type of scenario is not very desirable. And the computer was saying I could go for this and play a move like knight e5, but I just don't believe in this position at all. If bishop e6, just moving that bishop away, preserving the 2 bishops, and then rook c8 next, there's just no way that white will make any headway here. And to be quite honest, I would prefer to be black in this position because the 2 bishops are that important, even though the position would probably be close to equal. So that's one issue, is that just taking the knight and losing the 2 bishops would be a problem. The other issue is that my bishop on d5, remember, had very few squares on the diagonal. And you see b3 and c4 are both covered by this knight on a5. So if I go back to b3, black will happily snap off this bishop and then go rook c8. And not only does he have the two bishops, he now controls the one central file, and he's just going to start to slowly take over. This bishop might also be a strength on this diagonal. This bishop might pop out to f8. He might go f6 to control some dark squares, and then don't forget the pass pawns on the queen side. So this would be a huge problem, and why would be significantly worse? So that wasn't something I could really entertain either. So after e6, I thought I was more or less forced to play bishop e4. But you can see now that the bishop is on e4, I've ceded control of the c4 square. And the c4 square is a very critical square in the Grunfeld, especially when a knight is on a5, because it's usually how it gets back in the game. So normally white is trying to control the c4 square and stop it from getting back in the game, but you know, this is a huge problem. So now the advantage shifts to black because all of a sudden my bishops are kind of, you know, struggling, and black is first to control the all-important c-file, which really shouldn't have happened. I mean, if you look, you know, if we just back up several moves, I played rook c1 with the intent to firmly control the c-file. And then, you know, just a few moves later, like 5 moves later after e6, I'm giving it up. I mean, what a turn of events. So anyways, I went bishop e4, and black went knight c4 check, good move. And I'm kind of forced to play king e2 because if I go to, you know, the c-file with the knight, to attack the knight, rook c8 would be an absolute disaster because now my bishop is attacked, and if I move it away, there are all types of discovery checks for the knight once the rook is on the same line as the king. So huge problems if I go to c-file. And if I go to d1, I'm cutting off my rook from the action. So the only real square is king e2. And you can see here, there are all types of nasty ideas. There's rook c8, hitting my bishop. There's bishop b5, eyeing this diagonal. And, you know, it's just a world of pain, honestly. So now rook c8 was played, challenging my bishop. And I dropped it back to g3. And now this is probably the critical position of the game because black is first to the c-file and looks to have nice control. And I'm not quite ready because my rook is not on the c-file myself yet. So it seems like black can kind of, you know, play something here while I'm lacking some coordination. So why don't you give it yourself a moment and think, if you were black, how you would try to prosecute your advantage. Black to move. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out what you wanted to do. The right move in this position, and the move my opponent did not play, is actually knight a3. And knight a3 is fairly unique because it seems like you're moving your knight back towards the rim where, you know, we normally say the knight's on the rim or grim or dim or however we say it, and you just moved it away from a5. But the point is you're actually clearing the file for your rook to be activated, so my rook on h1 can't actually get to that square, to the c1 square. The flip side of it is that if bishop takes b7 is played, rook c2 comes, and that is a huge problem because, well, for starters, a2 is hanging, but the king doesn't have any effective squares to go to. And, yeah, it would just be a huge problem if knight d2 and then bishop b5 check is even a possibility. And with the king on e1, you could see now the rook is again kind of caught behind the lines. And after rook takes a2, black is seriously in the driver's seat because rook a1 check is a threat that, you know, you really can't parry. So this rook is going to be done. Note that the rook can't go to f1 because the bishop is guarding that square. So all of a sudden, this position would be, you know, very precarious. And after knight a3, well, I pretty much would have to keep my bishop on this diagonal. So I'd probably play bishop d3, only move to, you know, still guard the c2 square and also keep an eye on bishop b5 check. Note that if I played, you know, a very casual move, let's say like, well, I can't even go to b1 either. My gosh, b1 and c1 are covered. But let's say I went rook d1. Or excuse me, not rook d1, not rook e1, rook d1. Well, after bishop b5 check, if bishop d3 to block, now there's the nifty rook c2 check, and the bishop is pinned so it can't take on c2. And again, black is winning a very important pawn on a2 potentially, and this would be very problematic. So, oh, actually, rook d2 blocks here, but yeah, I'm not convinced in this position at all. And the point is, black is super active, so you really just can't get away with much here, and black would seriously be in the driver's seat. So yeah, knight a3 was a huge opportunity and a very unusual move. Black decided to play something a little bit more natural, and quite frankly, it was probably second or third best move, which is bishop b5. And this has its own merits because you're threatening, you're basically threatening a discovery. But on the flip side, this rook is not getting into the game right away and is kind of shut off. So I played my response bishop d3 fairly quickly, just making sure that I don't allow discoveries. And I have the added benefit here of actually pinning the knight. So it turns out that this gives me just enough to sort of maintain my coordination. And now I'm actually threatening rook c1, which, is a, desirable move, because then I would pin the rook on c8. So all of a sudden, it seems like I'm getting a little bit of coordination back in my position. Black now went for knight a3, but you can see the move order is slightly different. And this makes all the difference. So after knight a3, now I went bishop takes b5 and managed to trade those bishops. And note that rook c2 check as intermediate move doesn't work, because after king d3, he can't take the knight and hold on to the rook. So unfortunately, he has to take the bishop right away. And after knight takes b5, this is still a precarious position, because the rook is bearing down on c2, and there's also knight c3 check. But in this position, I went for king d2, and I stopped the rook from infiltrating on c2, and I also get my king out of the fire of check. Black now went knight c3, which is a good move, eyeing a2, and also eyeing e4 with check. And it kind of forces my reply, because I need to be able to contest on the c file. So I play rook c1, which actually pins this knight to the rook, but this actually allows knight e4 check. And you can see more pieces are coming off the board. And I have to play king d1, only move to hold my rook. And after rook takes c1, king takes c1, black played knight takes g3 and offered me a draw, which I, promptly accepted. I actually felt in this position that, black might have the better time of this endgame, having the outside pass pawn, and and also having the bishop versus the knight. It turns out that, the ending is like pretty much equal, and that white, and the computer evaluates it as such that white can kind of hang on and be fine. But I thought that given the course of this game and the kind of the momentum of the game had taken over the last half, a draw was an absolutely fair result, considering I thought I was in quite a bit of danger a few moves ago. So I thought, you know what, I might as well, close the shop here and live to fight another day. I must say I was very disappointed in this game overall. I thought that my play totally missed the mark. And, the more I looked at this rook takes d7 opportunity, this exchange sacrifice opportunity, it's something that's right up my wheelhouse, because it's a positional exchange sacrifice. I look to have a lot of activity in it, and it's also a queenless middle game, which is kind of my thing. So it was like, why am I not going for, a position that has all the elements I usually am very supportive of, enthusiastic about. So disappointing not to make that critical decision in the game. But I think it might have been first round jitters, and it is what it is. After the game, I actually analyzed a bit with my opponent, and I must say he was very gracious, and he actually taught me a lot about this Grunfeld line, just different details that I wasn't aware of. So I do want to thank him for that, even though I probably in the moment weren't in my most optimistic mood, because I really had basically drawn a game against someone like 300 points lower than me, and really was getting outplayed. So really, really tough one, but it was nice to talk to him, get a sense of his chess, and it also kind of told me in the back of my mind that many of these German players, of course you don't want to generalize, but I'm going to do it right now. Many of these German players are actually quite decent in the opening, and there's quite a good chess education that's happening there because, there's chess base and there are a lot of books and materials there, and it was clear that he was well booked and at least well read on chess, so he had a pretty good chess culture. And so I actually would argue that he's a little bit underrated. And I actually, would look around in future rounds and looked at some of his games, and I kept seeing that he had pretty good positions out of the opening. So, the flip side of that is that a lot of times you actually wind up playing opponents who are super, super good in the first 15 or so moves, and then, they might, their rating might actually show a little bit later, and that patience sometimes is required to beat the really stronger players. And you could see that in this game, he played the opening fairly decently, but then right on schedule around move 13 or 14, he played this bishop d7 move that allowed me an opportunity. So, just got to be patient, a little bit more focused, and, seize those opportunities and be ready for them because they will come. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please consider doing so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.